Don't Avoid the Rush Hour by Peter Richey. The trains had stopped running. Paul knew this the moment he awoke on a bench on the platform of Leicester Square tube station. The place was in total darkness. He was alone. There was silence. Only the mixed odour of tobacco smoke and vomit had lingered to remind him of his whereabouts. He looked at his watch. It was 3:30 a.m. His mind became confused. Could it be 3:30 p.m? An afternoon power cut, perhaps? But no, he began to remember. He had been drinking on the previous evening. He had spent some hours in a Wardour Street pub, and had even tasted his first vodka. He recalled feeling pleasantly old for 17. He had felt like a man in that pub. By the time he came to leave, he had smelt like one too. That was at 10:30. What then? Strip clubs, that was it. He'd walked past some strip clubs. Lovely girls, 10 bob only to you, sir, all naked. But he hadn't gone inside. The breasts on the photographs had looked revoltingly large, shaped like the domes they have in Russia. Besides, he'd read somewhere that strip clubs were for men who couldn't find girls. The thought of joining the ranks of London's dirty old men hurt his pride. So what had he done next? Nothing very exciting. Or surely he wouldn't have forgotten about it so soon. He was presumably still a virgin. Then he realised, with disappointment, that he had done nothing at all. He'd come into the station, he'd bought his ticket for Kennington, he'd wandered down to the platform, he'd sat down, and here he was still, nearly 5 hours later. How odd that they should have closed the station down for the night, without waking him. What time had he promised to be in by? Midnight? There would be a row when he got home. When? With sudden shock he realised that it was more than a question of if he got home. Like a man dozing in the bath who notices the water's run out, Paul began to feel uncomfortable. He became frightened. And cold. It was like being shut in a deep freeze vault. He had to escape. He stood up, swayed a little, then began to grope his way along the platform, keeping a hand on the wall to guide himself. His fingers slid across grubby advertisements, normally so bright and demonstrative, now impotently invisible. A change for the better, Paul thought with inappropriate flippancy. He was still slightly drunk. He remembered that somewhere along the wall was an exit to the moving staircases. If only he could creep his way to the surface, he might find an open window or something. But when his fingers felt cold steel, he knew he was trapped. A massive iron door was blocking the way to the staircases. London Transport's security device. Paul banged his fists on the door. The noise echoed like a gong down the platform and into the tunnel. It frightened him further and made his hands ache. He tried shouting, "Help! Let me out!" But he felt silly uttering such things. Help was an exclamation used on television and charity appeal posters, or in foreign lands, not in the underground. All change was the only thing people shouted in the underground. And anyway, he knew in advance that nobody would hear his cries. The streets were hundreds of feet above him. It was 3:45 now. Paul resigned himself to spending the rest of the night on the bench. He wandered back towards it. London Transport wishes Paul Lancer a very good night and trusts he will find it accommodation to his liking, Paul half sang, as if to persuade himself that it was all rather fun. Another manly adventure. But this false gaiety drained from him instantly. His heart palpitated. He was almost certain he'd heard a muffled "what" being spoken somewhere in the darkness. He stopped and listened intently. Not a sound. Too much vodka, he gladly and rather proudly concluded. He reached the bench and slumped down on it. Much too much vodka. The bench was soft and warm like a sofa. Then it wriggled. Paul gasped in horror and jumped to his feet again. There were no sofas at Leicester Square, however much you'd had to drink. He had sat on another person. Paul was halfway down the platform before he fully believed in the new situation. He hadn't noticed anyone earlier. He thought he could hear his own footsteps echoing behind him as he ran. But when he stopped to check, the sound continued. Click, click, click. He was being followed. He remembered something he'd once seen in a comic about commandos. He removed his shoes and ran on silently in his socks. Now he could move this way and that undetected. The pursuer would have no means of knowing where he was. Yet the footsteps continued. Click, 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 like a man late for work who doesn't wish to lose dignity by running. There was something appallingly methodical about the footsteps. They seemed to exist on their own, without a brain to control them, like an escaped robot working its wicked will in the absence of its master. The sock plan was not working. Comics were a load of lies, rubbish for children. Paul was 17. He drank vodka in Soho. Comics were rubbish. Paul crashed into a litter bin on the wall at the end of the platform. It buckled before the force of his stomach and winded him severely. The footsteps came closer and closer. There was only one way out of this. He stuffed his shoes into his jacket pockets, jumped down onto the lines and ran into the curving tunnel. The current was off, so he could tread on the conductor rail without danger. He stumbled on for about 100 yards, then paused to listen for the footsteps. They had stopped. Just as Paul was congratulating himself on his cunning, he heard the distant sound of someone jumping down onto the track shingle. Then the menacing steps resumed, running now, crunch, crunch on the stones, into the tunnel. Paul ran on, but the crunches were catching him up with alarming rapidity. By chance, Paul remembered that the tube tunnels have little recesses built into their walls for the maintenance staff to stand in when trains go by. If he could find one of these and enter it quietly enough, perhaps this unseen threat would crunch on past. Paul held his hand out to the wall just as he had done earlier on the platform. At last he felt a hollow. He crept into the recess and pressed himself against its back wall. The space was only 3 foot deep, and not much higher or wider, but it was better than nothing. Strange draughts kept descending from the blackness and blowing against him as he crouched. He tried to breathe as quietly as his overworked lungs would allow. His feet began to ache, and with his fingers he could feel great holes in his socks. He'd only had them for a week, and there was something about long life printed on them. That was a joke. Not that Paul laughed. He took one of the shoes from his pocket and ran his hand across the steel-capped heel. The footsteps were almost upon him now. "Go past," Paul pleaded silently. "For God's sake, go." He caught his breath. He had repeated the plea out loud. The game was up. He had given himself away. He tightened his grip on the shoe. The crunches, of course, stopped abruptly, just level with the recess. The person coughed in the dark and shuffled his feet on the shingle, wondering, no doubt, where the words had come from. Paul's lungs were almost bursting with restrained air, and he was certain his heartbeats must be audible enough for the stranger to locate his hiding place. But there's no way of hushing up heartbeats. The quieter you want them, the louder they go. Neither Paul nor the stranger moved. There seemed to be a kind of stalemate between them. If this were a film, Paul thought, now would be the time for the ice cream intermission. He longed to hear that stupid voice. "There will now be a short..." But the silence continued. There would be no drinks on sticks down here. He toyed with the idea of springing out from the recess and striking blindly with the shoe. Anything seemed preferable to the strain of this awful cramped tension. But somehow he couldn't bring himself to move. It was as if his limbs had detached themselves from his consciousness, as if they were no longer subject to the dictates of his brain. He regarded them as a commander might regard troops who have mutinied just before the battle, half angered by the disobedience and half relieved that the prospect of death or mutilation had been postponed. It was 4:30. Paul's legs had gone numb with cold and cramp, and his mind had become oddly removed from the danger he was in. Fear paralyzes portions of one's awareness. Nature's safety catch, perhaps, provided to prevent insanity developing in moments of crisis. Now the man took to walking up and down with slow, deliberate paces, as if looking for something he'd dropped. 10 paces one way, 10 paces back, then off again. He seemed in no hurry. Perhaps for him the pleasure lay in anticipating rather than carrying out his foul plan. If so, he was certainly making his fun go a long way. He didn't seem to be making any real effort to find Paul. He was like some glutton, wandering round a feast table, sniffing the flavours and contemplating the joys to come. His steps lulled Paul's mind into a state of semi-trance. He began to engage in luxuriously remote speculation as to what the man looked like. Was he tall or short, young or old? Had he a beard? A tramp, perhaps? Yet the paces had been too fast and sure for a down and out. He must be young then, or at the most, middle-aged and vicious, maybe even mad. Paul was hardly aware that any of it concerned him at all. The safety catch was down. The ticking of Paul's watch mingled with the beats of his heart and with the crunches on the line. A sinister orchestra with too much emphasis on percussion. But at 4:45, a hopeful thought dragged Paul's mind from its stupor. It was nearly daybreak. Soon the early staff would be down. But above all, the trains would start running. If only he could hold on for another half hour or so, there was a good chance that the man would be reduced to a bloody squashed hulk. This prospect both thrilled and horrified Paul. It would be most unpleasant. But on the other hand, what alternative was there? If you stand on a railway line, you can't expect to be granted right of way. Slowly the luminous hand of Paul's watch crept round the dial. 4:50, 4:55, 5 o'clock, 5:10, 5:13. At exactly 5:15, Paul heard a sound like the sizzling of sausages. There followed a short pained gasp. Simultaneously, the tunnel lights went on. Standing on the lines was a skinny man of about 40, dressed in a shabby suit that was several sizes too large for him. The eyes beneath his battered bowler hat were staring intently at the wall above Paul. His face wore a startled expression, with the mouth slightly open. He looked very pale and ill under the dim illumination. At his feet lay an open briefcase, and sticking out of this was the gleaming blade of a sharp knife. Quite suddenly the man swung round on his heels and fell, rigid as a tree, to the ground. The sizzling noise began again, and Paul noticed a smell of burning. A small flame appeared under the man's stomach. Within seconds the body was engulfed in fire. Orange and yellow streamers leaped and stabbed up at the vaulted roof. Paul crouched, immobile, in the recess, nearly choking from the fumes and wanting to be sick. The man began to twist and turn and twitch. He sat up inside the flames, fell back again, arched his back, kicked his heels frantically. Paul caught a brief glimpse of his face. The eyes were staring with blind madness now, and seemed to be on the point of melting, and the jaws were opening and shutting, as if chewing a tough piece of meat. The skin was charred and peeling from the skull inside. The body collapsed and lay still again. There was a popping sound, followed by a foul stench, as his stomach bag burst. Intestines flowed out and were consumed in the flames. The clothes were all gone, and ribs were poking from the trunk like teeth on a giant comb. Paul could stand no more. He slipped his shoes on, pulled himself from the recess, and ran off down the line towards the station. As he rounded a bend in the tunnel, he looked back over his shoulder. All he could see was a cosy, homely glow of the sort that goes well with Christmas carols, but the smell wasn't turkey. The station came into view, all lit up now. As Paul emerged from the tunnel, an alarmed sweeper waved a broom at him. "Not supposed to be down there. S'pose a train come along. Stupid young fool. Right mess you'd be in, and don't ask me to sweep it up." Paul climbed up onto the platform. The sweeper came closer. He was old and bald. He squinted at Paul, obviously determined to make the most of his small authority. "Just a minute. Shoes undone. Hair like a haystack. What's going on? What have you been up to down there? You ain't one of these drug people, are you? One of these hipsters, eh?" It was useless trying to explain to this man. "I dropped a coin on the line. I went to pick it up," Paul mumbled flatly. This was no time for polished acting, and the sweeper was not convinced. "Dropped a bloody coin? At 5:30 in the morning? What was it? A gold sovereign?" Paul pushed past the old man and ran through the exit that had been blocked by the steel door. "Come back, you young hooligan, you bloody hipster. I ain't done with you yet." Paul went up the moving staircase. He must find a sensible station official, or the whole place would go up in smoke. It had all happened so fast, like in a nightmare. He could hardly believe his own experience, and the rest of the station seemed so normal. Was it really possible that a body lay burning less than a mile from these slick underwear advertisements? But by the time he reached the top of the staircase, Paul had changed his mind. He would tell nobody, disclaim having had any part in the affair. The station people would discover the body soon enough, and it was unlikely that anyone would listen to the sweeper's story about the hipster. Nobody would ever find out that he had been anywhere near Leicester Square that night. Paul slipped out of the station by a side door, unnoticed. It was half light and very chilly in the streets. He began walking rapidly in the direction of Kennington, across Charing Cross Road, round Trafalgar Square and into Whitehall. He heard a violent ringing noise. A fire engine sped past, followed by 5 more. Then a solitary ambulance went by. Paul started to laugh uncontrolledly. "Ashtrays!" he bellowed. "He needs an ashtray, not an ambulance." Imperceptibly, his laughter changed to tears. He cried and cried. A few early walkers pretended not to notice. Some drunken idiot, they judged, absolving themselves from further involvement. Nothing to do with us. It was only when he reached Lambeth Bridge that Paul began to realise what must have happened in the tunnel. The sizzling noise must have been caused by the man being electrocuted when the current was switched on. The gasp had been a dying one, and the pale, inquisitive expression had been that of sudden death. But by some freak of balance the body had remained on its feet for a few seconds before falling. Paul was on the verge of taking pity on the man when he remembered the knife in the briefcase. There could be no sympathy for a man with a knife like that, for a man who had attempted murder. Paul arrived home just after his father had left for work. His mother came to the door. "Had your dad and me worried to death, you did. Had no sleep all night. Lucky you missed him. If you'd seen his face. And don't you look awful." "Thanks." "Come in and wash your face. It's covered in black. Can't think what you've been doing. Don't much like to either. I shan't ask where you've been. I know a thing or two about what boys do at night. I didn't marry your dad for nothing. But I mind my own business. Don't go poking my nose where it's not wanted." Her words droned on, a stream of well-meant triviality. They meant as much to Paul as would the sound of rain on a window pane. After breakfast he went to bed and fell into a troubled sleep. He kept seeing an image of the burning man's contortions. Over and over again he saw that agonized face with the jaws opening and shutting. and the knife blade was there, all wound up with the central theme of death. He awoke in time for tea. As he went downstairs, he caught sight of the evening paper lying on the kitchen table. "Man burned to death in tube," was the headline. Paul went over and picked up the paper. "Mr. Wardale, 42, it went on, whose burnt remains were found early today in the southbound tunnel of the Northern Line, between Leicester Square and Strand stations, was unemployed and lived at 17 Kempley Street, SE 13. It is thought that the fire was started by the electric current igniting the contents of a cigarette lighter discovered among the bones," said 50-year-old Mrs. Crawford, his landlady. "I asked him to get me a new knife that's just come out. It's specially for cutlets. He was a lonely man, and he'd been all depressed lately, due, I suppose, to his being jobless. When he got like this, he used to go all funny and absent-minded. He hardly knew where he was half the time, and he would follow strangers through the streets for hours on end. He wanted company. I can't believe he's gone yet. He was a perfect gentleman, for all his strange ways. The last thing he said before he went out to get my knife yesterday afternoon was how he'd once seen some beautiful girl at Leicester Square station who'd smiled at him. He said he'd find her again, even if he had to wait there all night. I don't suppose there was any girl there, and if there was, she was most likely laughing at him, not smiling. He did look funny in his flappy old suit, even though he was keeping up appearances. As I say, he was funny like that, but he was only trying to be friendly.